Hello, my name is Angie Gachui, and welcome to the Identity Talks. The Identity Talks is a space where we talk about everything diversity, equity, and inclusion related from an African perspective. And this episode, brought to you by New Faces, New Voices, and Women Win, features a very lovely lady, Miss Agnes Makena, who is over here with me. Welcome, welcome,
Thank you,
welcome,
Angie.
welcome.
Thank you.
And she is going to tell you all about herself. But today we're going to be talking about gender lens investing and everything around that. Agnes, or should I call you Makena?
Whichever.
Now we are on like official channels. Maybe I'll just call
Whichever
you Agnes
you're more
for now.
comfortable with, yeah.
Agnes, I'd love you to introduce yourself to all the listeners
Yeah.
by whichever identities that you want to talk about, and tell us what you're passionate about.
Great. Thank you, Angie. And thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here and to speak about something that I love and work in. I am Agnes Makena. I am currently the Gender Lens Enterprise Lead at Plan International, which is an INGO that is operating in Kenya, that is striving to strengthen the rights of children and young girls and women everywhere. Yeah, that's as far as my professional identity.
Yes.
Personally, I'm also part of the New Faces, New Voices Champions group.
Yes.
I was actually one of the youngest people to join the network.
Yes.
It's been an exciting time getting to know all of the lovely women and learn from each other.
Wonderful. So what are you passionate about?
Gender.
Gender. Okay, cool. I kind of figured that.
Yeah, I'm passionate about gender. I am really passionate about bringing out people's voices in the various ways, not necessarily related to gender, but expressionism through art, through creativity, and the various like passions everyone else has. I find different, I would say, mediums of expression very interesting.
Yeah.
And so music, art, all of that is very interesting for me to explore as well.
And yet today we're going to talk about something that doesn't sound as creative, and that's gender lens investing.
Yeah.
So gender lens investing is a term that's floating around. We've heard it quite a lot, probably in the last decade or so. I think there's been a heavy push on it.
Yeah.
But let's not assume that all our listeners know what gender lens investing is. So maybe you could tell us from a layman's perspective, what is gender lens investing and why is it important?
Thank you. Well, I'll try and make it creative still, not make it very boring.
Yeah.
But simply put, gender lens investing is the integration of a gender lens in the investment process. The investment process goes through various stages, starting with the structuring of an investment, the instruments and the vehicles that you're going to use. It's also in the deployment of that investment based on a certain maybe thesis that you come up with that guides the deployment of that financing and the mandate that you have as an individual, an entity, or an organization. And then there is also the criteria for selection on who actually gets the investment.
Right.
And then finally, there is the post-investment support.
Okay.
So supporting your investee to be able to grow or expand businesses or whatever entities you're investing in. And so integrating a gender lens means looking at the impact of this investment on different genders. Usually it's synonymous to, when you say you're doing gender lens investing, it's investing in women.
Women, exactly.
And the reason that has come about is because there has been a lot of focus for a lot of entities on understanding the impact of investment to both men and women. And usually when you're doing that assessment, you look at the group that's more disadvantaged or that doesn't have access to those products and services. And usually women come up as that group.
Right.
And so that's why gender lens investing then took a turn to sort of representing women because they were getting the short end of that stick. And so gender lens investing really is investing in both men and women, depending on which gender comes up as the disadvantaged, maybe franchise or group.
In the specific context of that particular investment.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. So I want us to turn this conversation a bit more locally now that we have an understanding generally of what gender lens investing is. When you think about the Kenyan context, are you seeing gender lens investing being more prominent or prevalent in certain sectors? Is it a conversation that is restricted to the corporate sector? Are we seeing activity in the public sector? Are we seeing activity in the nonprofit sector? And how are things going? Is this are we doing well, or are we just talking about it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There are various ways that investors will do gender lens investing. Some will take the approach in investing in women or women-owned businesses. Others will take the approach in looking at gender equality or inclusion in a company. So looking at the senior leadership, mid-management, and even the board of directors to assess whether there's a good balance of gender. Others will look at procurement and who you're sourcing products and services from or rather the supply chain, and whether there's a good balance of gender there. Others will look at policies as well in your company to assess that. And so there are different strategies that different investors take. And in Kenya, we found that there has been a significant growth in gender lens investing. Since 2015, I think over $284 million has been deployed.
I'm writing this down. $284
million has been deployed since 2015. And this is based on the most, I think, recent research piece that I will also selfishly quote is from Plan International, Disruptive Roles in Gender Lens Investing in Kenya. You can get the statistics there. But what's interesting is some of the sectors that the financing has gone into. The two key sectors in terms of the amount of funding are financial services, and then there's also agriculture. And this corresponds really well with the general impact investing landscape, where a lot of financing has also been going to the same two sectors. And then you include energy to that as well if you look at impact investing. There's also a lot of there are a lot of ways that you could see the beneficiaries in gender lens investing being women within those two sectors. One, there has been the fact that there's been lots of financial exclusion of women. I think the most significant example that always comes to mind was when we were looking at smartphone and smartphone penetration, and then the access to the internet, the access to M-Pesa and all of these great services that really push people's lives forward, even through earning an income. And GSMA ran a study where they noticed that a majority of the people who had smartphones were men, and a majority of the people then who had access to all of these very beneficial things were also men. And so that caused a stop in everything to understand then we're running financial inclusion, in a country, but are we unintentionally excluding another gender? And so that's the need for a gender lens, really, when you're looking at the products and services that you're building. And now with a lot of drive for financial inclusion, there's been a lot of focus on women in bringing them into the conversation and access to products and services, as well as agriculture with the significant number of women smallholder farmers, the fact that they don't get a lot of return as compared to men in the farming industry, also driving agro-processing and ensuring that there's more value addition to the kind of work that they do, so that they're not just stuck in the fields, they're able to actually start lucrative businesses out of this. And so I would say that forms part of the reasons why those are two highest sectors. There's something that you've said that's really, I think maybe I had underestimated the importance of looking at even pre-investment, right? And obviously it's about the enabling environment, the operational landscape, that while we talk about gender lens investments from the point of deciding what kind of investment you want to make and the sector and et cetera, there's something about, are the building blocks even there? If you choose to invest in whichever gender is marginalized, but they can't access some of these services, whether, to what you're saying about mobile penetration, the number of unbanked individuals, predominantly, a lot of them are women as well, because of, could be things as simple as, what does it take to open a bank account, right? And if we don't sort of pay attention to that section first, then I would imagine, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that we could be doing gender lens investing, but we are still further excluding those who are even more marginalized, because they don't have access to the most basic, inclusion services, or
even digital literacy, if we start doing things that are very, tech, financial services related, then somebody who's like, I don't know how to use, I don't know how to use a computer. I don't know how to use an app. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really brilliant point, Angie, because for instance, taking your last example on maybe digital literacy and investing in it and making sure that people are earning an income through digital products and services, right? That's a great way to support that development. But you also have to come back to who has digital literacy skills? How do you build capacity for that? How do you build the technical needs for women who have not had as much access to men in this, given, society and this like kind of industries that we tend to go to? Then you have to start there. You have to start addressing the gaps at the root of the solution, at the root of the, challenge. It can't be a top-down kind of approach with gender lens investing. You first have to look at the market, assess where the gaps are, and then look at the needs. And then in addressing those, then you're able to get whatever dividend you get at the top. And another interesting example is like with the unbanked population, who are a majority is women, is there was a whole drive to include more women in finance, especially to become banked. And what a lot of players immediately started doing was creating products for women.
For women, yes, right? I remember.
And that was a huge push in Kenya. I remember there were all of these products every bank was releasing.
I had a Diva account from Standard Chartered. And it was this pink card.
Right, exactly.
And I was like, I don't know how I feel about signing this pink checkbook to my very, blue, male, corporate dominated space. I'm just like, sign a pink checkbook.
And yes, that was actually the term that everyone coined, like pink washing of products, where you say that you're creating a product for women, but are they even able to access this product, or are you just revamping the product to look like it's a certain color that they would like, marketed to women, but not really built with women's user like centricity? Or even understanding of some of those gaps, like the lack of collateral to even access that they didn't have. You're not innovating on, but you still say the product is for women. And so they, like you said, there really is a need to understand what the root problems are and challenges, and then refine those in a way that whatever product or service you release is actually targeted then to that customer.
It's sparking two questions in my mind. Let me start with the first one. You see, the understanding of that landscape and things that might seem very basic, let me say, the importance of understanding that she doesn't have access to collateral. And we do know that a lot of these decisions, particularly the investment ones, are not made from within Kenya. A lot of them are made from larger funders, larger donors, larger investment firms, maybe private equity, venture capital, there are many. What is the receptivity? How are they receptive to conversations around, hey, as we say in Kenya, kwa ground, things are a little bit different. And you do need to pay attention to maybe some criteria or some realities that are not within the formal gender lens investing checklist, for example, and maybe spend time investing in understanding, right? Does the investment actually cover that landscaping analysis to understand which is the sector that you're actually operating in? What are the real challenges that they are facing? Or are we kind of still in a space where this is the best way to do gender lens investing and we're ticking off boxes? That's my first question.
Well, I'll take that one first. One, I would like to caveat that in the conversation, I'd also like to look at women in the different groups. I don't want for us to say it's a homogeneous group, which I tend sometimes to just say women are lacking this, but it's not every woman that is.
You're right. You're right.
And so if we're looking at maybe promoting financial inclusion, it has to be for the women groups, particularly with medium, small enterprises, who cannot be able to access like collateral that's actually required maybe to get financing. And coming back to your question, I think there's been a really good reception and understanding of gender lens investing. I think it's been growing significantly in that donors are now starting to understand the gender gap that exists in financing, in access to products and services, all of the different variations of that gap. And then there has been more research to prove a business case, which is always important in the business world. There's doing good to create good, and then there is, does this actually create a financial return? Is there a
Right.
financial impact out of this?
Yeah.
And so there has been a lot of research to also create the business case for why you need to create inclusion of women, to increase GDP, to increase the outcome and returns from investment, to increase a company's growth. Through gender diversity and equality, we see research actually showing really good case studies
Yeah.
of that and
Yeah.
proving that through data. And so that, combined with the need for it, has led to a collaborative approach from a lot of donors in investing in gender lens investing. And here in Kenya, the uptake has been useful because donors will invest in funds.
Right.
They're also the ones who come up with a mandate for the fund on where to invest. And so if your donor tells you that they would like to have a gender integration into the fund,
Yes.
then you have to see the way to like take that up as a fund. It's really hard for sort of like the middle group where the fund is, because it's the donor or the limited partner, and then there's the fund, the general partner, and then there's actually the investee.
Yes.
So in the middle there, it's very hard for you to just come up with your own idea of what you want to do.
You have to incorporate the different perspectives.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have to like get different perspectives in. You have to get buy-in from whoever's funding, even giving you the money before you deploy it there.
Yeah.
And so because of that, gender lens investing has been increasing. We're also seeing a lot of amazing women owned businesses coming up, and the enabling environment for them to come up has also been really good through access to incubation and acceleration services. And so while there is the supply of capital, there's a rising demand of the capital as well, which is really required for a market to really grow.
Yeah.
And so I hope that answers your
It
question.
does. It
Okay,
really
good.
does. It really, really does, because it's encouraging to hear that there is a more collaborative approach. Different perspectives are influenced. And I would imagine that even over time, as the impact coming out of this, $284 million, for example, is monitored and captured, and the lessons and the insights learned, then we'll only have more nuanced and more relevant gender lens investing practices as well, which is always encouraging. The second one was just a comment, really. Actually, there was something you said when I asked the question about the sectors, and you spoke about the different focus areas or priorities that different funds have. And I think that's so encouraging, because I feel like when we're looking at gender lens things, right? I'm just going to say things because there's like investment, there's like, diversity and inclusion, there's so many
Products and
concepts,
services.
products and services. There's so many aspects to gender lensing things. People feel like it's a lot to do, right? And you have to be gender mainstreamed in every aspect. And what I found is then it makes people feel, or organizations feel, that it's harder to start. So what I thought was really encouraging about what you said is there are some who are like, look at your supply chain. What can you do in your supply chain? Look at your internal systems. What can you do there? What does your leadership look like? Like, there are actually dimensions that an organization can start with without feeling the burden of like, I can tick all 15 boxes, and now I can say that I am a gender mainstreamed or a gender inclusive organization.
Right.
So I just wanted to appreciate that statement. So during COVID-19, we can't have a podcast without talking about COVID-19.
Yeah.
We've seen a lot of one step forward, two step back kind of instances and narratives, especially as regards women economic empowerment. I think we know the extra burden of care that women were predominantly carrying in terms of being caregivers, in terms of being teachers. A lot of them lost their jobs disproportionately when you think about it, according to men versus women, because of more women in the service industry, for example. And so I was curious, from your perspective, how has COVID-19 as a pandemic, there are other pandemics going on. If you think about climate change, if you think about a number of, let's call them political and social crises that are going on around the world, have those had an effect, whether positive or negative, on the space of gender lens investing, particularly in Kenya?
Yeah, you're right in that COVID-19 had disproportionate effect to women as compared to men, and that translated even with investment. Already, the number of gender lens investors is still low as compared to, the larger number of investors really in any market. And then you add the fact that it's already harder for women to access financing in some other channels.
Yeah.
And so then COVID-19 meant that there was less investment actually going to women at that time. A lot of funders were, putting a stop to the investment process to first see what's happening, support even previous businesses they had been supporting so that they don't, die in that period. And so just like the market faced the gap with financing, the gender side was also equally affected. But I think I saw a really encouraging thing in that a lot of investors, particularly foundations offering grants, decided that they wanted to now get into gender lens investing at that time, because it was almost a clear call that, look, women are being more affected by this than men. If you weren't convinced about the gender gap before, now you're convinced,
Here's evidence.
Exactly, here is evidence. And who's there to support those women, And so a lot of investors actually took it upon themselves to actually fund women-owned businesses at that time, or businesses creating products and services that enhance the lives of women at that time, to sort of bridge that gap there and reduce the impact that it had on women. And even past that, we're seeing a lot of conversations on not just trying to save women when disaster strikes, but build their resilience.
Important.
After there has been COVID and we've learned our lessons, and those who were investing at least have a good understanding of what is required and where they're at and what the impact has been. Now the conversation is around how do we build women's resilience to survive such disasters, whether it's with climate change, whether it's with hunger in our region, whether it's in health issues such as COVID coming up. What are the right mechanisms that we can build to ensure that these businesses are able to survive just as good as male-owned businesses are able to survive, and how can we bring them up to, an equal level? So it's been very positive, I would say.
The conversation about resilience is so critical because we can have all these interventions and they are well-intentioned. They are very well-meaning interventions. But at the end of the day, I think what we have seen, maybe not necessarily in the gender lens investing space, but in other sectors, when you think about women's economic empowerment, it almost gets to a place where there's a bit of a patronizing approach to, we must save this woman. When you think about all the things that she's going through in her life, I don't know that saving is the word, or is what it is that she requires. Rather, the tools to be able to weather the storm, whichever the storm is, and be able to operate in a much more autonomous, exercising her agency, and maybe being protected from some of the very, very steep crevices that she might have to encounter, and just figuring out how to not have that be such a deep and steep drop, right? But I do feel like the resilience conversation is so critical, and it's actually much more sustainable when you think about any form of investment. Okay, so now I want you to bring your creative hat. We've talked about the concepts. We've talked about the things that certain funders focus on, some of the barriers, the enabling environment. So what does it actually look like when gender lens investing or investment is done right? What does a successful investment look like? What, is there maybe not an example per se of an actual organization, but what are some of the benefits that we stand to see? And I know that there are many perspectives. There's from a government perspective, these are some of the benefits you can see. From an inclusive business perspective. But I'm trying to paint a picture in my mind of, if gender lens investing works well, this is sort of what I will be able to visualize and see in another 5-10 years.
I really like that question because it allows for me to have a ridiculous amount of optimism, in answering it, sharing all of my dreams and thoughts. So I would say that let's start with the investment first. A successful gender lens investment will be structured for women targeted towards women. If we say gender lens investing right now and like put women as a target group for that, then I want to see a world where investments are actually structured in a way that they address the needs of women-owned businesses as much as they address the needs of male-owned businesses. There was a study done a few years ago, I remember reading it, and they were talking about the archetype for investment, particularly with VC funding, venture capital funding in the US, which is where a lot of the studies were being done then, because that's where a lot of it was being deployed. But they had this thing called pattern matching, where every investor has an idea or a persona of who their investee usually is based on the history of the investments, where the investment has done well. And so you don't try and like disrupt that status quo. You just continue with that, right? And the archetype for that was really a man, or, someone of the male gender, coming from an Ivy League school in certain sectors that were considered very attractive, like tech back then, with certain team members, coming from a certain race even.
So the African woman was not featuring there as an archetype.
There was not, there was no African woman there. There was no representation of either the African, the African race or even gender. And so imagine that this is the way that investment has been structured to fit this archetype, and then come and continue to invest that way in Africa, targeting the African woman, then surely some things are going to be missing there or misaligned. And so I would really love to see a world where if we're going to say that we want to do gender lens investing, let's start with how do we structure this investment to fulfill the needs of women and men, to address the challenges, to create growth in the businesses. The other way would be to also support, add more post-investment support. I feel like a lot of businesses get invested in, but really require continued support to be able to grow. And it's useful for the investor because you are almost sure, or you are assured of some of the risks because you have a hand in how the business grows, which is really useful versus deploying investment and then, following up and hoping that the investment will actually have really good returns. I think from actually deploying gender lens investing in that way, then we can see a growth in women-owned and gender-inclusive businesses as compared to other like businesses in the market. Through gender lens investing, I'd also like to see actual gender equality growth in the various industries. And so by including women in your investment process, that means that you have more women portfolio enterprises, right? And so we're not seeing certain sectors with almost 70 or 80%, male-founded businesses earning investment, but also see like a nice balance out of that, which will mean a lot of growth to our economy and will create all of these beautiful success stories that will inspire other women to start businesses in those sectors, because there is the opportunity there. There is an enabling environment, and there's a success story that you can count on to be able to achieve that. Finally, I would like to see an end in just gender blindness. I feel that...
What is gender blindness? We're adding terminology, listeners. We're adding terminology.
And I promise not to use terminology, but here I am. I'll try and break that down. I feel that a lot of times when I'm having conversations around gender, some people will just avoid me and say, hey, women have been focused on for a while now. We don't want to support women just for the sake of supporting women, or that I don't see any gender gaps. These things are almost like made up. And we're only coming up with random data and statistics to support our story from imright.com or something. And I feel that really impedes the conversation because there's a really big gap in understanding that gender is actually, like, having a gender lens is actually important. Let's start there. Assessing the impact of whatever your business operations are. If you're building products and services, you have to look at who's your target customer. Are you, by targeting this person, sort of excluding this person? What would be the impact that you would have by including this other person? If you're providing investment, don't say that because you don't even look at like who's the founder of the business, then you're, gender aware. No, it just means that you're gender blind, because by not looking at the type of founder for the business and who they are, you don't understand the needs. You don't have a nuance on how to support and how to structure whatever you're providing to fit their needs. And so I really feel like that's a huge impediment in the conversation that I will have with very interesting people, running, corporations and institutions that really would create change if they came on board. But because of I don't look at who I'm investing in, therefore I am doing the right thing, then it kind of brings us back and really holds us back. And so being gender aware as an organization, having the right gender assessment to understand the impact of whatever product and services you're providing, that is a dream. And like the biggest thing that I think will really change one day in like, I don't know how many years, but seeing gender mainstreaming everywhere. And I say that knowing that there are different ways to create gender inclusion in whatever.
Yes.
But just looking at maybe a company and the company immediately from the time that it started, from the time they're building their business model canvas, and
right from the beginning.
Yes, right in the beginning, you are looking at, okay, what's the impact of like women here? What's the impact of men here? Like, are we excluding or including,
Yes.
And I feel like if you have that ethos right from the start, and we have as many companies like running now that will tell you we actually have a certain degree of gender equality, we've paid attention, we've been intentional about it, how different would the world be?
It would be so different. And in a way, I say this all the time. We are fortunate at this point in time that we are pretty much at a 50-50 split in terms of the number of women and men, or the number of females and males in the world. Pretty much a 50-50 split if you don't account for gender identity, how people choose to identify, and more like just the basic biological component, right? We're at 50-50. So anybody who is running a business, for example, would want to know what would it take to capture 100% of the market.
Absolutely.
So by not paying attention and by being blind to the fact that there are differences in our preferences, in our realities, in our context, in our struggles, you're de facto leaving out 50%, whichever which way you look at it, right? If you are purely focused on women, you're leaving out 50% of your market as well. And if you're purely focused on the male gender as well, you're leaving out 50% of the women. Same thing for the workforce, same thing for supply chain and production and services. And I think that to me is the most basic explanation that I can share with anybody who's wondering, why should we think about gender equality at a minimum from a representation perspective and participation perspective in economic activity? It's that they are your consumers. Like 100% consumption is better than 50%,
Absolutely, yeah.
But one thing I've appreciated about how you've been speaking about gender lens investing is a very clear awareness that we're not talking about women only. And often I think in this movement, gender becomes synonymous with female or woman. And so I've heard narratives of people saying, there's a disproportionate amount of effort, time, resources being allocated to activities that are trying to support women in this space under the guise of gender. I think we've heard many, many narratives about what's happening with the boy child, et cetera, et cetera. So as a gender lens investing and maybe just a gender champion generally, how do you respond to these, I don't know if they're skeptics, but how do you respond to these comments that there's too much investment, too much time, too much talk? It's enough now. How do you respond to them?
Well, like you started, there's too much focus on this, there's too much focus on this, as there should, as there should be.
You're like, yes, put more focus.
Yes, because really, we need to address the gender gap. Like, I think what someone saying, making a statement like that, it's not coming from a point of malice. I think it's a little bit coming from a point of ignorance or lack of information. And so the minute we create more awareness about the gender gap that exists in various sectors, socially, economically, politically, the effects of those gaps as well, then you will understand the need for this conversation and why so many people are jumping on board and, to promote the SDG 5, because there's there's a need for that. There's a reason it's part of the SDGs, and it's because for a long time women have gotten the shorter end of the stick across the various societal spectrum.
That's true.
And so to be able to at least give them an even playing ground, we're not talking about giving them, an unfair advantage.
Yes.
Just an even playing ground to be able to succeed, have autonomy, have agency, and grow as a whole society, achieve the dreams that we all want to, then we need to focus on the disadvantaged group.
Yeah.
That's where it all comes from. And you'll probably be seeing more of this, for a while, until we've made what is actually significant progress towards getting there.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're coming to the end of our conversation. I could go on with this for ever and ever and ever, but we will have more episodes. So what is your parting shot? And I'm leaving it open because we've talked about so many things, and gender lens investing is very broad. So I'm just going to leave you to give us your parting shot for all our listeners and all our viewers. What do you want to say?
Well, I'd like to say that advancing gender equality is not as complicated as it sounds. There are very many ways that you can advance gender equality as a business, as an investor, even as an individual. One of the ways I try to, when I'm buying products and services, is looking at who they're coming from, and the gender balance behind some of those companies. It could be something as small as just buying your groceries or water. Like, who are you supporting? How are you trying to impact that change that you want to see? And I think there should be continued conversation on this. It should be an open discourse where no one feels that they're going to be shot down if they bring a controversial statement or if they're ignorant about a certain subject. I think that anyone who's involved in gender is always happy to start the conversation from scratch, share why we talk so passionately about it and why there needs to be change. And there are always questions that you should ask, and I'm sure you will always get answers to those questions. So just keep the conversation going, and start being the change that you want to see, honestly, because we can do a lot as individuals. We don't always have to rely on, corporates and other entities to be able to do it. That would be my parting shot.
I love it. Start being the change that you want to be. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Makena, I'll
This
end
has
with you.
been so
I'll
much
end with
fun.
calling you Makena. Thank you so much for sharing so passionately about gender lens investments. We will be talking more about diversity, equity, and inclusion in subsequent episodes of the ID Talks. Thank you for joining us. My name is Angie Gachui, and have a good day.